Okay, well, we're back again. We just covered chapter 36. We did 37 last week because of the length of it. And now we're going to go through chapter 38. And we really are in the section of Genesis that deals with the life of Joseph. But this chapter is going to take a side turn. Remember the last time we looked at life of Joseph in chapter 36, no, 37. His brothers had sold him into slavery and they took him down to Egypt. And so now we're coming back, uh, and this is going to talk about one of the brothers. And so we'll just go ahead and get started on chapter 38. This is one crazy story right in the middle of the history of Joseph. And it's one of those chapters you'd like to just skip over, like genealogies, but and you wonder, why is it even in the Bible? But the Lord needs us to understand the lineage of Jesus. Remember, the entire Bible from Genesis 1:1 all the way to the end of Revelation 22 is the story of Jesus. That's what it's all about. So every one of these chapters, no matter what the material is, all point to Jesus. And so this chapter 38 I entitled, Whoops, I Didn't See That Coming. And so the Lord needs us to understand the lineage of Jesus. And a son is going to come out of this story named Perez, and he's going to be in that line. And after reading this, you're going to have to wonder how the Lord could possibly come through the line of Judah. I mean, it's just shocking when you read the story, but this is one really messed up family tree. And I guess the answer is grace. And as you get farther out into the story, you'll find out that Judah turned out to be an okay guy. But he is the one, the brother Simeon said, let's kill Joseph. And the older brother Reuben said, no, 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 let's just throw him down in the cistern and then he'll die of starvation and thirst. And then Reuben left to take care of the flocks. And Judah steps up and says, no, 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 let's not let them starve to death down there. They see a caravan coming and said, let's just sell them to the caravan and we get some money for them. And so that's kind of where the thing left off. The caravan took Joseph, headed down to Egypt, and he was sold to a guy named Potiphar, who was the chief executioner in Egypt under the Pharaoh. So that kind of brings us up to speed here. So we're going to see more of Judah here now. He sold his brother Joseph to the caravan. Now we're going to see this story about him. So one more truth here is that the entire Old Testament is a picture of Satan trying to prevent the coming of the Messiah. That's what we see all through this. And I believe Satan must have thought Joseph, being the favorite son of Jacob, was the one that God would pick to be in the line of Jesus. And so he went out of his way to destroy Joseph, kill him in the well, sell him down to Egypt where he'll certainly die and never have any kind of influence. And that's why he tried to get rid of Joseph. So as we get into this story, Genesis 38, verse 1, it came to pass at that time, and I read this is about 1728 BC, before Christ. Joseph was sold to the caravan, that Judah departed or separated himself from his brothers and visited a certain Adullamite whose name was Hira. In our days, you have to be as old as me. Remember people like Eddie Haskell and how your parents never wanted you to hang around with people like Eddie Haskell. I think growing up with Randy and I, the parents of our friends didn't want them hanging around with us. But Hira is just somebody you wouldn't want your son hanging out with. Now, in verse 2, and Judah saw there a daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua, and he married her, and went into her. So he's marrying a Canaanite woman. And so she conceived and bore a son, and he, this is Judah, called his name Er. Then she conceived again and bore a son, and she called his name Onan. So there's a real difference there. He called the first name son. She ended up naming the second son. Then she conceived yet again and bore a son, and she called his name Shelah. And he was at Chezib when she bore him. So these are the first 5 verses. So it tells us it came to pass. So about the time Jacob is mourning Joseph's supposed death, right? They bring him a bloody tunic, and he's sure that a wild animal, devoured his son. And so they've just let him believe all of that. And maybe Judah just wants to get out of town before his dad finds out it was his idea to sell Joseph to the Egypt caravan, in case one of his brothers ends up confessing out of a guilty conscience. So Judah is the fourth son. Remember, Reuben is the oldest. He wanted to rescue Joseph from the pit, but instead of just standing up for Joseph when he had the opportunity, he's the one that slept with Bilhah, the concubine of his father, Jacob. Then you have Simeon and Levi. They're the two that went in and slaughtered all the men in the city of Shechem and took all of the women and children and all the cattle and destroyed the whole town, just ransacked the place. So Judah is number 4. He's the next one in line. We don't know that yet. We don't know it till the end of Genesis, but you can see the first 3 disqualifying themselves. And now Judah has sold his brother into bondage in Egypt, and he decides to leave home and live among the Canaanites. So he's completely gotten out of town, and maybe just feeling remorse, can't stand to be at home seeing his dad Jacob suffering. So he marries a Canaanite, just like his uncle Esau did. Again, intermarriage with pagans, and what could possibly go wrong? Well, a spiritual truth for us, for our youngsters: don't mingle with the unsaved, making them your best new friends or marrying into them. I mean, it's very likely to turn out bad for you and for them. And the Bible calls it being unequally yoked in 2 Corinthians 6:14. The Lord tells us, just don't do that. Don't get mixed up. Don't get married to them. Shouldn't even bother dating them. And I'm getting engaged. Don't go into business with an unbeliever, because it's going to end up causing problems along the way. Now, an Adullamite is somebody that comes from Adullam, and it literally means justice of the people or a place to hide. And basically today it seems to mean hide justice from the people. I mean, that really, I think that's what the meaning of this is, to keep justice away from the people. Now, Kira or Hira, it's Kira in the Hebrew, means splendor or nobility. So this was an important guy, a big shot. And we'll see him 3 times in this story, and he's just a bad influence. Every time he pops up, something else is bad happens. So he introduces Judah to a pagan woman. They go party hopping, and it pays off. He ends up paying off a harlot, a hooker. I mean, that's basically it. He pays her their fee for the service of Judah. So this is not the kind of thing you want a believer to be involved in. But it's all hanging around with this guy who just gets you into one problem after another. So the lesson here: don't let your kids hang out with an Adullamite who's named Hira. I mean, just, if you got a daughter, don't let them hang out with Hira. Now, 1 Corinthians 15:33b, it says, bad company corrupts good character. That's probably a verse we should store away in our minds. Whenever you get around people of bad character, you're going to have a problem. Shua means wealth or riches. This is where they're from. And so he marries into that family. There's no wedding feast at home, right? So his brothers aren't involved. His dad isn't involved. The moms aren't involved. There's probably no dowry involved. And she has 3 children. They do together. Er, E-R, it's pronounced Er. It means watchful or awake, alert. Then Onan means strong. And then Shelah, it's not Sheila, it's Shelah. And that would be like naming him Sue, like the Johnny Cash song. Wouldn't want to name him Sheila. But his name means prayer or petition. So that's interesting. Now, notice here, the father always named the sons in Israel. I mean, that's just what God told them to do. And yet she names the second and the third sons for some reason. He has nothing to do with it. And the 3 sons by a Canaanite woman, which was discouraged by his forefathers, in Genesis 24 and again in 28 in a couple of different verses. These are pagan neighbors. They corrupt the entire family of Israel. It's going to lead to unintended consequences. God said, don't do it. Esau did it. We saw how that turned out in chapter 36. It's a big mistake to make. So as a spoiler alert, maybe God has a plan to get Israel, Jacob, and the nation out of Canaan land. And Joseph's going to play a big part in it. We're going to see this in the coming chapters. And Chizib, it looks almost like a Cheeto, Chizib, means falsify. So that's the name where they're from. Now, verse 6, it says, Judah took a wife for his firstborn. So Judah picks a wife out for him, and her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord killed him. Pretty harsh. He had no future but wickedness, and God took him out of the game. In verse 8, Judah said to Onan, go into your brother's wife and marry her, and raise up an heir to your brother. But Onan knew that the heir would not be his, and so it came to pass when he went into his brother's wife that he emitted on the ground. He pulled out early, TMI, lest he should give her an heir to his brother. And the thing which he did displeased or was evil in the sight of the Lord. Therefore, the Lord killed him also. That's 2 for 2, 2 strikes, you got 1 strike left. So this story doesn't start out good. It says he took a wife. Here he selects his son's wife for the son, like normally would happen. Yet his dad, Jacob, plays absolutely no part in Judah's wedding, which is strange. He doesn't want to be around his dad. And I imagine it's out of a guilty conscience for what he did to his younger brother, Joseph. So Judah has 3 sons with a Canaanite woman, but he knows the seed is supposed to come through his seed. So he goes out and finds a wife for his son. He knows it's supposed to come through his family. And so knowing his 3 older brothers are probably disqualified, he's probably the next in line, and he's going to be the one. So he has to have a son that's going to survive and go through all of this. And Tamar, or Tamar as we pronounce it, her name means a palm tree. She's also a Canaanite woman. Now, if we look at the name, means wicked, or he erred, and the Lord whacked him. There's no lineage of the Lord for you. He sounds like the soup Nazi on Seinfeld. No lineage for you. So we get no indication of what he did. God just says, you got my reasons. He's dead. Nothing to see here. Move on. So we will. We just leave it there. He did something, and God didn't like it. In Romans 6:23, it says the wages of sin are death. And in this case, it certainly was. Sin always brings about a penalty, and this guy brought it on really soon. And so this is a first mention here of God killing somebody. He actually took him out. The guy wasn't shot with an arrow by somebody else. God took him out. And this reminds me of Ananias and Sapphira in the book of Acts, chapter 5, where they lied to the Holy Spirit about the money they got for selling their property. And they were struck dead right on the spot for the whole brand new young church to see, to send a message to them that the church won't tolerate this. You can't lie to God and the Holy Spirit and expect to get away with it. And so today we read in 1 Corinthians 11, this should be a warning to all of us. We're told that people die for taking communion unworthily, that we're supposed to inspect ourselves and make sure that there's sin in our lives. We confess it and repent of it before we take communion. Otherwise, you can be drinking a curse back onto yourself. Now, based on the Hammurabi Code, which we talked about some time back, and the Levirate law, or husband's brother law, it was a marriage law. It said if the next son was to step in and bring forth kids for a dead older brother. So if I died off, Randy should marry my wife and have kids with her, and they would be as if they were my kids. That's how this whole thing works. Or if something happened to Mick, Greg would have to marry Mick's wife and then have kids with her, but the kids would be in Mick's lineage and get the birthright. So that's what this Hammurabi Code and Levirate laws, marriage laws, refer to. So you would bring forth kids in the name of your older brother so he would get the blessing passed down through his descendants. So think of it like the principle of the kinsman redeemer, which I suggested a while back of reading in Ruth 4, verses 5 through 8. And it was later put into the law in Deuteronomy 25. So you can read about it there as well. So we have he's struck down. Then we have Onan. He doesn't want the heir to the Messiah to be his brother's lineage, right? He wants it to be in his lineage. He wants to have a kid of his own with his own wife. And then his kid would get the birthright from him and be in the lineage of the Messiah. So rather than do that, he doesn't finish off the act of having a child with his brother's wife, Tamar. It's what we used to call birth control before there was birth control. You just called the episode off before it was finished. So some use this passage to say that birth control is sin or self-pleasuring is sin. And that's not what this verse is talking about. It's not what it means. He didn't want to produce a kid to get the birthright as Er's lineage because there'd be no benefit to him. That's what this whole paragraph is about. So if he just went in and had kids of his own, he would get the birthright blessing since he'd be the oldest son of Judah. And yep, the Lord whacks him too for what he did. I mean, this is just a crazy story. But no, for not providing a son for his dead brother. That's the reason. It was wicked, it was disobedient, and it was rebellious. And God said, no, he's not going to be in the line of the Messiah. And so he took him off the scene. So the verse says, when. So we don't know when Onan went into Tamar, but when he went into her. But more properly, the word is whenever. When you look it up in the Hebrew, it is often, almost always used as whenever he went in. So it would appear he was doing this frequently. He didn't mind going in and having relations with her. He just didn't want her to have a kid, which is also being disobedient. So he wanted the sex without the responsibility. and he didn't want to give up the birthright to his brother who had passed on. So you could read about this issue in Matthew 22, in the book of Luke that we were studying for a while. Maybe we'll get back to at some point, where the Sadducees try to trap Jesus with a story about 7 brothers who are married to a woman. Each one dies, and the next brother has to take her as a wife, and he dies, and the next one, and all 7 of them die. And then they ask Jesus, whose life will she be in the resurrection? And it's kind of a funny story because the Sadducees don't believe in the resurrection. So they're trying to trap Jesus. And he says, you guys are totally off the wall. In heaven, there is no marriage. So he doesn't say there's no resurrection, but nobody will be married in heaven. Then it says, so think about that. I wrote, if this lady had 7 husbands and they all died early, would any of them wanted to be married again to her in heaven? Probably not. I mean, that's it's like a black widow. So there's 2 down now. There's 1 to go. Batter up. Shelah is standing in the on deck circle. And I wouldn't want to be the next one up because it seems like the Lord is in a bad mood. I'm just kidding. This kid hasn't done anything wrong that we know of at this point, but his dad's concerned. He's concerned. Nobody wants to be married to this gal. Now, when I was playing in Middle League baseball, we were playing a practice game one day, and our pitchers were getting killed. And I told my coach I could do better than the guys who he put in there to pitch. So he put me in to pitch. I hit the first 3 batters on 4 pitches, 3 hit batters, bases loaded. I only thrown 4 pitches. And the kid who was on deck started crying. And so the coach pulled me out of the game. That was my experience as a pitcher. But I thought of that as I was reading the story about this 3rd brother. He was crying in the on-deck circle. Now, one thing before we go on, in the book of Ruth, you have the story of the kinsman redeemer, which is really a picture. This is a foreshadow of the kinsman redeemer. Chuck Missler made an interesting observation of this story in Genesis 38. He said, every 49th character or letter, for us, letter of the words, every 49th letter, as you read across, multiples of 7, right? 7 times 7 is 49, is repeated 3 times, and it spells out the name of a character in the book of Ruth. And they're all in specific order. It begins with Boaz, the man who's the kinsman redeemer, then Ruth, then Obed, then Jesse, and then King David, the lineage of Jesus, all in chronological order. I mean, what are the odds of that? I have no idea about how that could even be possible. But if you take all the words in Hebrew, every 7th letter, every 49th character or letter is repeated 3 consecutive times, and it's the name of Boaz, and then you go 49 more letters, and it's Ruth, and it goes right down through the list of the lineage.
All right.
So all in chronological order, and clearly this entire Bible is not a bunch of stories written by a bunch of men. It's God himself using men to put on paper his very words. And if you can find that in the book of Ruth, I imagine that exists all through the Bible. We'll probably spend thousands of years in Bible school when we get to heaven, just uncovering all the places it taught us about what was coming, and we never saw it, never understood it. So now in verse 11, it says, then Judah said to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, remain a widow in your father's house till my son Shelah is grown. For he said, to himself, lest he also die like his brothers. So Tamar went and dwelt in her father's house. So now she's a widow twice. She's living in her father's house. There's no dowry, so dad has to take care of her. And she's going to wait until Shelah, the 3rd son, grows up old enough to be her husband. And it says, Judah is saying Judah is saying to himself, unless he dies like his brothers, right? The implication is you're the problem, Tamar. I don't want my only son that I have left married to you. You have to be a pro. You're like that black widow we hear of in the stories with all the husbands dying off. So he said, let's just wait until Shelah is a little bit older, and then out of sight, out of mind, sort of thing, right? He has no intention of letting her marry his son. So he lies, and God hates lying. This is not going to turn out well. In Proverbs 25:14, in the CIV version, it says, broken promises are worse than rain clouds that don't bring rain. Now, I like that translation of that verse. It's worse than rain clouds that come over and never bring any rain and nothing grows. So as an observation here, Tamar isn't the problem. He didn't kill the two sons because of something she did. He killed them because they were ungodly kids. And it's the Lord that's whacking them, not Tamar. She didn't do anything. God took them out of the game. So Judah is spiritually blind at this point in his life. He's not walking with the Lord. He's done some really stupid things, ungodly things. And that's partly Jacob's fault as his father. Almost all of his kids are spiritually blind at this point. I mean, we see this one after another. They're all doing stupid things, ungodly things. So Judah could have taken responsibility for her and provided for her, been her husband, but he just dumped her off on her own father. So now we're going to get into Tamar's revenge. We could have named the chapter Tamar's Revenge. In verse 12, it says, now in the process of time, the daughter of Shua, Judah's wife, died. So now the wife that Judah had of the Canaanites gave him 3 sons, and now she's dead. And Judah was comforted, and he went up to his sheep shearers at Timnah, he and his friend Hira, there's Hira again, the Adulamite. And it was told Hamor, saying, look, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear the sheep. So she took off her widow's garments, she covered herself with a veil and wrapped herself, and sat in an open place which was on the way to Timnah. For she saw that Shelah was grown, and she was not given him as a wife, or as her husband. Now, when Judah saw her dressed up like a harlot in the city gate, he thought she was a harlot because she had covered her face. And then he turned back to her, right? He walked past and he turned back. It's always that second look that gets you in trouble. He turned back by the way and he said, please let me come into you, for he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. I told you it's a weird chapter. Now, Tamar is basically trapped, and she's under the control of Judah. He has a son. He's not letting the son marry her, and she's stuck at dad's house with no dowry. No inheritance from dad. So he's the one that's required to provide for her a husband from his sons, and if not, he himself. And she has been obedient to Judah all this time. So we're reading this story, and it seems kind of odd what she's doing, and it doesn't seem like the right thing to do, but you understand how this is developing. And it seems like the clock has run out on her patience. She doesn't have any children to support her, so she's going to become destitute at some point and living in poverty. So she needs to do something. And as that old story goes, hell has no fury like a woman scorned. She is really ticked off. So Judah becomes a widower. He's fairly young still, and he's now widowed. And recently, if you haven't already read, 2 pastors of mega churches in Texas were forced to step down. One had sinned sexually as a young evangelist. The other one sinned when first widowed. I've heard all kinds of rumors about what it was, but we just don't know. But in any event, they both had to step down or were asked to step down. So these are two really dangerous periods in life, when you're youthful and when you become a widow. Even for those that are highly regarded in ministry, these are two very well-known pastors of two very, very large churches. In 1 Peter 4:17, we're told, "For the time has come for judgment to begin at the house of God. And if it begins with us first," which is what we're seeing today, "what will be the end of those who do not obey the gospel of God?" So if God is going to be punishing these men of God and pastors that are leading flocks and believers who are living outside of his will, and they're going to be punished, then how bad is it going to be for people who don't have a relationship with him? And I believe this prophecy of Peter's is coming to pass right now before our very eyes. There's been a third one now, but I don't have enough details to even share it. So Judah saw her, lust of the eyes, lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, pride of life. It's always one of the three. Now, Timnah means an assigned part. It was given to Judah as his land, and later it would become the land of Dan, one of his brothers. It's a prophesied name being fulfilled. And his friend, now for some reason, the Lord had me look up this word in Hebrew, reah, and I didn't know why, because I know what a friend means. What I found out is that the word is normally used to describe a homosexual or a friend who has intercourse with, meaning Judah and Hira were probably really good friends. Don't know for sure, but that's the meaning of the word. And I looked it up, and that's what I found in Hebrew. Now, it was sheep shearing time. So this would basically become a festival or party time, right? Eating and drinking and partying. They're shearing the sheep and selling off the wool and making all kinds of money. And so they party, and all the farm hands or sheep herders that work for them are partying and drinking and getting drunk and, going out and shearing the sheep. Probably a lot of sheep with shear marks on them. And Hamar says, now she took off her widow clothes. She covered herself with a veil. In other words, meaning I'm available in that culture. She wrapped herself in seductive clothing, sat at the gate of the city, and she disguised herself as a hooker, a temple prostitute. Probably sounds a little better. And waited until he walked by. Now remember, she's the widow of the first two brothers that the Lord killed off. And she's upset because the third son, Shelah, is now grown, and Judah didn't give him to her as a husband. So I can't say I blame him, but he did lie to her. He didn't obey the laws, and his actions led her to commit this sin. So they're equally guilty in this sin. And we've looked at this so many times in Genesis, sowing and reaping. How many times have we seen this? He deceives her about the third son. She turns around and deceives him right back. We saw it with Abraham. We saw it with Isaac. We see it with Jacob and Esau, with these brothers deceiving their father about what happened to Joseph. And now here Judah gets deceived. He deceives his dad by selling Joseph off to the caravan, and now this girl deceives him. So she takes matters into her own hands. Was she waiting for Shelah to come by, as some suggest? I guess it's possible, but I doubt it, because she went when she heard that Judah was going to be there. And she's the one he's ticked off at. He's the one that would have to give his son. So she's upset with Judah, and she's going to get even. Now, as a point of history here, in that time and culture, the Babylonian times, temple prostitutes were thought of to be doing God's work in honor of Ishtar, their god of fertility. Ishtar is, well, I'll get to that. By laying with a temple prostitute, it was believed that everything in your life would be fertile or fruitful. So sadly, this is where abortion began, to get rid of the unwanted kids. In that culture, these women would get pregnant and they would abort the child and get rid of it. So that's where this whole practice began. It's not something, we came up with here. We've just perfected it and then paid for it all over the world. Also, sadly, from Ishtar, which is where this comes from, this religion, we get the holiday Easter, Easter Ishtar. And we should really call it Resurrection Sunday. I've stopped calling it Easter because it's ridiculous. It's about rabbits and eggs, and rabbits don't even lay eggs. I mean, rabbits are fertile, and eggs are the produce of being fertile. So we should do away with this whole Easter thing as Christians and just call it Resurrection Sunday. But Judah is living like a Canaanite, not like a Jew. And so she said, what will you give me? Right? So he's what is the word? Propositioning her at the city gate. He said, so what will you give me that you may come into me? In other words, how much are you willing to pay me? And he said, I will send you a young goat from the flock. Sounds pretty romantic. So she said, well, I don't see a goat. So will you give me a pledge till you send it? In other words, how about something else until I get the goat? Okay, collateral. Let's put some collateral down. She's running a pawn shop, and she knows this guy's a liar. He's lied to her now about the third son, so she's not going to trust him. And so he said, well, what pledge shall I give to you? So a pledge is like a security deposit, if you will. You put down a security deposit to rent a building or to buy a house, or you put something in pawn and you're going to buy it back within a certain amount of days. And so she said, how about your signet ring and your cord and your staff that's in your hand? That's a lot of stuff, worth a lot. So then he gave them to her, and he went into her, and she conceived by him. One and done. So she arose, and she went away and laid aside her veil and put on the garments of her widowhood. Went back to dad, and that's done. And she's got all of this guy's stuff. So why these three things? Well, they would be personally identifiable things. So she's setting him up. She knows who he is. He doesn't know who she is. And all of these things identify him for who he is. So he gives up something valuable for momentary pleasure. Didn't Esau do the same thing with his birthright for some chili? We see these things repeat again and again and again through the first 38 chapters of this book. And they continue through the rest of the Bible. Nothing new under the sun. So our question is there anything we would give up our character and reputation for? Typically it's sex or money, or there are other things that can entice us, power and position. If so, we need to deal with it quick, because Satan will use it to trip you up. We've got to be really, really careful. Now, signet ring or a seal is kotham. It's like a family crest. It's interesting. This is where they got the idea of wedding rings. That's where wedding rings came from. It's a ring being a pledge, so like an engagement ring. And it'd be used like a credit card, like asking if she takes Visa or MasterCard. Right? You would stamp your ring into some wax, and that would have your family crest on it, and you'd be good for the money, and then they could collect from you. So this represents his person. If you want to break it down, the ring or the seal represents his person. Then he has a cord, a pathiel. It could be a bracelet or an armlet, but it's more likely a lace or a ribbon that you wore around your neck that you hung this ring on. Or it could be a twisted thread. but probably a string or a wire that the seal ring was suspended on. That would represent his possessions or his wealth. And the staff is mateh, which means a rod. It could be for hitting something, a sign of ruling or authority over, for throwing, for a walking stick. Most likely it represented his tribe, the tribe of Judah. So this would represent his position, right? So we got his position, his possession, and his person. She's got him nailed. So this is somewhat like we leaving something at a pawn shop until we come back to redeem it. So that's the idea. He's going to have a goat sent to her and he'll get all of his things back through, guess who? His friend Hiram. So she takes off afterwards with all of his stuff, supposedly until the goat arrives. But this is kind of like watching Days of Our Lives or The Bachelor, or Naked and Afraid or something, which I don't recommend any of those. But or thinking what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, right? David made the same mistake with Bathsheba. He could make that mistake and then he ends up with her pregnant. Then he has to have her husband killed in battle. Then the son that they have dies in birth. I mean, the whole thing is just a disaster. So in verse 20, Judah sent the young goat by the hand of his friend Hiram the Adullamite. So now he's paying off a temple prostitute to receive his pledge from the woman's hand. So he's bringing the goat and he wants to get back all of Judah's stuff, but he can't find her. Then he asked the men of that place, saying, where's the harlot who was openly by the roadside? And they said, there was no harlot in this place. So he returned to Judah and he said, I can't find her. Also, the men of the place says, there was no harlot in this place. So Judah doesn't want to go back, bring a goat to a prostitute. So he sends his friend Hiram. And it sounds like a recent court case where a former politician sent his former lawyer to pay off a hooker. Nothing new under the sun. Ecclesiastes 1:9. Stuff still going on today. And he does what he said in order to get his things back. So he kept his promise because he wanted them back. They're far more valuable than a goat. But she's disappeared. And the townspeople say, we haven't seen a harlot here. So in verse 23, Judah said, well, let her take them for herself. Let her keep the stuff, lest we be shamed. For I sent this young goat and you've not found her. So okay, let's just forget about it. This is embarrassing enough. So an observation, he's more concerned about his reputation than the sin he committed. And he values man's opinion over God's. Now, verse 24, and it came to pass about 3 months after that Judah was told, saying, Hamor, your daughter-in-law, has played the harlot. Furthermore, she is with child by harlotry. So Judah said, bring her out and let her be burned. So now Judah hears that his daughter-in-law is pregnant out of wedlock because he didn't give her the third son. And so he says, just get her and bring her out and we'll burn her to death. And again, this sounds like King David when he was confronted by Nathan, the prophet, over the Bathsheba situation. I mean, that's a great story you could read in the Old Testament. But the chicken has come home to roost, as the saying goes. Legally, she belongs to Shelah, so she's guilty of adultery. And adultery would be a penalty of death. But so is fornication, and that's what Judah just did because he's not married to Tamar. So, I mean, this just goes back and forth with the rules and the laws. So the spiritual truth here, I think he wants to kill her, torch the tramp for adultery, yet he's done the same thing. And this is called out by Jesus when he warned us about judging someone when we have a log in our own eye, right? It's easy for us to see sins in other people that we ourselves commit. So Judas has a bee struggling with what he did with a harlot, Tamar, unknown to him, and feels so guilty he wants to take it out on the harlot. So I mean, this whole story is just unbelievable. And then burning. The penalty for in Israel for adultery was stoning, not burning. And it would be done to both persons involved. So maybe this was the pagan penalty to burn you to death instead of stoning you. But remember the woman caught in adultery that was brought to Jesus? And he uh, asked them all to pick up a stone. The first one without a sin, throw the first stone. And the older to the youngest started to walk away because there was nobody there that could throw the stone there. Everyone was guilty of sin. And then Jesus let her go. When in Romans 2:1 it says, you therefore have no excuse, you who pass judgment on someone else, for at whatever point you judge another, you are condemning yourself, because you who pass judgment do the very same things. So I wrote a note down here. If you see someone that's always harping on a particular sin, pay attention. They're probably guilty of that same sin. We used to say it takes one to know one. And it's funny how our sins look so much worse when someone else is wearing them. Now, another observation here is that Tamar conceives. Judah surely never expected her to be pregnant. He doesn't even know it's her. He didn't expect this person to be pregnant. He also hasn't put two and two together, right? Tamar and the harlot he slept with was about 3 months ago. And now that person is no longer at the city gate. He's not making a connection. And he's about to get blindsided, right? Deception, sowing and reaping. And that wasn't in his plan, but it's in God's plan. And there's a reason for it. Now, when she was brought out, she sent to her father-in-law saying, by the man to whom these belong, I am with child. And she said, please determine, Judah, examine, take a careful look at these. Whose are these? The signet and the cord and the staff. So as we would say, busted. Hey, Judah, take a real close look at these items, right? Whoever they belong to is the father. Do they look familiar? Huh? Father-in-law? Gulp. She probably had a big smile on her face as she saw his reaction. And what sins we commit in the dark will be brought out into the light. It's a warning and a promise from God. Don't want to be doing any sinning because it always comes back to bite you. Jewish historians write that it was Judah who asked his father Jacob if the bloody coat belonged to Joseph. And now he's being asked the same question by Tamar, basically. Are you the one that's committed this sin? So verse 26, so Judah acknowledged them, and he said, she's been more righteous than I have, because I did not give her to Shelah, my son. And he never knew her again. So it was one and done. He made a mistake. He owns up to it. He fesses up to it. So at this point, at least he's being honest. He understands why she did it. He'd broken his promise to her. It was an unkept vow, and God promises to punish us when we make a vow and don't keep it. That's a serious, serious thing to do. Now, note, it's interesting that he disappears from history after this event. Only his line carries on. Judah's not much more involved after this. Now, perhaps he repented and turned back to the Lord. I don't know. I hope so. I imagine he has, because the 12 sons of Jacob have their names on the New Jerusalem, as do the disciples, apostles. So I'm pretty sure he's going to be there. Now, verse 27, and we'll see why here in a couple of chapters. Verse 27, now it came to pass at the time for giving birth that, behold, twins were in her womb. So we've seen this story before with Jacob and Esau. And the question, how did they know there were twins without an ultrasound? I mean, that's a good question. I don't have any idea. 28, it says, and so it was when she was giving birth that the one put out his hand, and the midwife took a scarlet thread and bound it around his hand, saying, this one came out first. Then it happened, as this first one drew back his hand, that the brother came out unexpectedly. And she said, how did you break through? So this breach be upon you. Therefore, his name was called Perez. And afterward, his brother came out who had the scarlet thread on his hand, and his name was called Zerah. Now, remember, these two are Judah's sons, and this is important in the lineage of Jesus. And the one Perez will go on to be in that lineage. And I had a friend, Monty Perez, played baseball with in high school. Randy might remember him when he watches this. So the scarlet thread, Shawnee, means crimson. I wonder, Shawnee Indians, if their name was named after crimson red for some reason. But this was done in multiple births to identify the firstborn so that they would be the one to receive the birthright. So there'd be no mistaking the two kids once they were laying down and you were cleaning them all up and wrapping them up and stuff. You wouldn't make a mistake between the two. The one with the red ribbon around its hand would be the firstborn. Now, I say Perez, Fares, or Peretz in Hebrew means to breach or to break forth. In other words, he was son number 2. And Zerah, Zerach, is rising of light. He was son number 1. And so, although Zerach stuck out his hand and received the red ribbon, his mother brother snuck past him and became the one in the line of Messiah. Basically, he passed him in the right-hand lane, if you would. I couldn't help myself. So it will be Peretz that ends up in the line of Messiah. You could read that in Matthew 1 and in Luke 3. You see his name pop up in the lineage. There are also four women named by Matthew in the line of Jesus. Tamar, this woman, the prostitute. Rahab, also a prostitute in Jericho. Ruth, who's the book of Ruth is written about, a Moabitess. And Bathsheba, an adulterer with King David. All of them in the line of Jesus. So as an application, don't be too quick to point out someone else's sins while ignoring our own. The Lord will be sure that your sins are found out if you do. And as a life lesson, God can and does work through imperfect people. And that should give all of us hope. So when Satan comes along and says, look at what you've done, God can never use you, just remind him of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Judah, right? And Tamar, King David. It just goes on and on and on. Every person sins. And then remember that God decided to not remember your sins any longer when you gave your life to Christ. He doesn't forget them. He chooses not to remember them. So we're new creations now. And don't let Satan bind you up in the things that God chooses not to remember. If God doesn't remember them, I could care less if Satan does. His opinion doesn't matter. And my final thought in here is in those days, they had temple prostitutes, and it was considered a religious practice. Now, in my day, we had Playboy and Penthouse magazines, and we had XXX movies. We saw James Bond movies and then shows like Dynasty where sex had no consequences. It just became part of normal television. And then we moved on to pornography online. It's perfectly harmless, no harm, no foul, nobody's physically damaged. We were being conditioned by Hollywood and media all of this time, all the way back to when I was growing up my teen years in the early 60s, late 50s, early 60s. This has been going on for a very long time, and now they're doing it to our kids in preschool and kindergarten. So we should know this sounds very familiar. Today, our very kids have access to all of this garbage on their cell phones. All of this pornographic stuff, all the sexual things are on their cell phones, easy for them to access. And I wonder how many parents are checking their kids' phones today on their computers to see what they're looking at. And this explains why the average kid today has sex at the age of 16 and the average age of marriage is 27. I think about that. They're going to be having sex with people for 11 years before the average person gets married, which is a perfect setup for abortions because there's pregnancies without marriages, so the child is aborted, and they end up in failed marriages. Well, Satan has been working overtime through the ages to corrupt the line of Jesus. He took a real good shot at it here with Judah. And when that failed, he decided to destroy his children. And that's the church that we're part of. So the New Testament calls it the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life. And we have to be careful for those because they trip us all up. They have in the past. They probably do currently from time to time. They will in the future. I mean, that's our flesh fighting against our spirit to be in control of our body. Our flesh will say, let's do this. And the brain will say, okay, that sounds like a good idea. And your spirit will say, no, whoop, time out. We're not going there. We're not doing that. And you have to make a decision which one you're going to listen to, your flesh or your spirit. So that is it today for chapter 38. And next week, we're going to get into the story now of Joseph in Egypt. And the story just gets better and better. And Joseph is kind of a forerunner of Daniel. Neither one of them have a single sin mentioned in scripture about them in their books. And then both of them point obviously to Jesus. So we're going to see a lot of Joseph like Jesus type of stories and verses and words as we go through the remainder of these stories starting next week in chapter 39. So that's it for this week, guys. Have a good week, and we'll see